tall skies, fireplace beneath the stars. Stories that they told us, stories that they told us we believed, and there we fell in love. From there we fell in love. But we have gone, but we have gone. Oh, baby, we started when we were younger. 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 Sing a song, dance along, turn to believe, gazing through fire flames, stories that they told us, stories that they told us, believe, and there we fell in love. From there we fell in love. But we have gone, but we have gone. Oh, baby, we started when we were younger. Oh, baby, we started when we were younger. Oh, baby, we started when we were younger. Oh, baby, we started when we were younger.
Hi, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Graduate School of Architecture Professional Practice Lecture Series, Ways of Working. My name is Mark Raymond, and I'm the Director of the Graduate School of Architecture here in Johannesburg, at the University of Johannesburg. And I'm really pleased this evening to be able to introduce Mokena Makeka, who's going to be talking to us about his practice. It's the third of a series of lectures that we're having this semester that to which we've invited practitioners to talk about their work, but importantly to talk about how they practice, their approach to their practice, how they do what they do and why they do what they do. We think it's an important lesson, and there's important lessons in learning from this. Very often architects will present their work, but it's not often that they present their practice, and it's part of an interest in we have in the school with engaging with the idea of practice. And in fact, next year we are going to be operating a new program. It's a postgraduate diploma in architectural management, and it's a program that will allow us to develop thinking and ideas about practice. And you'll get a little graphic coming up soon that will we can share with you about that program, and some information about that will allow you to contact us if you're interested in the program. This is some information that you should be able to see, PG, Postgraduate Diploma in Architectural Management. And for more information, there's an email address at the bottom there, aready@uj.ac.za. You can contact Adeshni, and she'll be happy to provide you with more information on that diploma that will, I think, be the source of some quite interesting work that we plan to be doing at the school. But this evening, we are going to be hearing from Mokena, and he has quite a reputation that precedes him, as they say. It's one of the names. Certainly, I'm not from South Africa, and his name certainly written large globally in terms of South African practitioners. He was raised in Maseru, Lesotho, and also in New York. He's a graduate of the University of Cape Town, where he graduated with honors from their program. And he's also been involved with the Harvard Kennedy School, Oxford University, WITS, and many others. Currently practices in Cape Town, from Cape Town, and he also has positions at Cooper Union, Carleton University, and various other institutions. So he's really quite a prolific practitioner, and also involved in much wider and broader debates and discussions and discourses about architecture. So without any further embellishment, I'm going to let him speak for himself. And I should say that if during the presentation that Mokena is sharing with us today, you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. At the end of it, Professor Christo Vosloo, who's the coordinator of the professional practice program, will look at them, and he's going to chair a little session at the end of questions and answers, and Mokena will be happy to answer your questions about his practice and his work. So Mokena, I'm handing over to you, and thank you so much for agreeing to come and share some time with us this evening. We're really honored, and we're really excited to see and to hear about your practice. Thank you.
The pleasure and excitement is mine, Prof. Raymond and Prof. Vosloo. I want to thank you and the school and all the students who've taken the time to come out at this time of the evening to engage and be a part of this discussion. Before I show some slides, I thought I'd give you some just internal reflections, if you will, in terms of what is the nature of practice and what it is that we do as architects. And I was struck when I was thinking about preparation for this particular session. There was one time I was asked to give a lecture, and I proceeded to have only 4 slides. And in those 4 slides across the 45 minutes, I decided to break down a number of ideas. And when I left the podium, people pulled me aside and said, "But we came here to see buildings. Why didn't you show us buildings?" And in a way, I felt that I had let down my colleagues by not doing a whole sort of architectural sort of exposition. But at the same time, I felt that the question also spoke to this disconnect, if you will, because ideas inform buildings, and ideas are buildings, and not all buildings are built from the ideas that actually created them. So there's something about the practice of architecture which I think honestly does reside in the theoretical and thoughtful realm, and then it gets translated into built form. But the built form is a product of a thought process, but we should not assume that the product itself is a direct corollary of the original idea, right? So and this gets us into the realm of thinking about almost as architecture as art, practical, habitable art, of course, but one in which it's the intellectual journey about what is the spatial experience, the tectonic experience, the functional experience trying to convey. And then when we build, we approximate that particular journey to the best of our abilities. But ultimately, we are ultimately artists of thought. It's just that our language happens to be in space and brick and steel and so on and in form. So on the one hand, I did feel I disappointed my colleague. On the other hand, I actually felt that I did exactly what was required, because I think one can talk about architecture in the realm of ideas and see buildings not necessarily as the automatic conclusion of that, but a partial expression of what those ideas could be. So without any further ado, let me go into some slides and some description of my work, and hopefully we'll have some fun together. I hope you can see that landing slide.
Yes,
Are
we
we
can.
good?
Yes.
Fantastic. So my journey. First of all, I have a sort of love-hate relationship with the question of authorship in architecture. What I mean by that is the notion of the clear body of work that moves from the model to the first sketch to the final building and so on, which has the author stamp on it. In many respects, um, architecture, I've mentioned at one level, resides in the head. So it's very much a sort of almost private intellectual activity. But then on the other hand, on the opposite side of the spectrum, it's a collaborative act that involves a whole range of expertise and technicians and clients and other forces that make buildings come into being. So there's always a bit of a debate for me when I talk with artists about authorship. It's a very different conversation than when I talk with, let's say, designers and architects and others who our authorship is pushed and pulled by these other sorts of forces. I mention this because my architectural journey really started as a student. And one of the first things I did as a student is I was quite clear about not actually signing or putting my name on my drawings. This was partly driven because I was suspicious that there was bias for the lecturers at the time, that they would see the name and decide to give it a particular mark. So I was very much a fan of anonymity, that the idea that the work is more important than the author, and that the production of architecture does not necessarily even require a name. And in fact, I still have a dream of one day running studios where people just get numbers, work gets put up, all the work is critiqued, and you end up critiquing the work itself and not the person. Which lands us on this particular image that you see in front of you. Very early on in my career, I was interested in this question of what is identity, what is authorship, and I saw parallels. Just to give you a sense of a perspective, I started studying architecture in 1995. So this was the year after 1994, and I saw lots of parallels in terms of the emergence of a new South Africa, and in many respects, how the constructivists on the back of the Bolshevik Revolution tried to create an alternative society. So there's a phrase which I thought was really quite amazing from that time, which is "Levoye Iskustvo," which is Russian for leftist art. It was an argument for a different way of seeing things. I was really impressed how the constructivists from Malevich and from Tatlin and others attempted to even redefine the language of architecture, and we see the trace of that in the work of other more recent architects such as Hadid and others in terms of the deconstructivist movement. So going all the way back to this earlier period about what is the language of architecture, what is its syntax, what are its instruments. And the reason that this is important is that I was very keen on, in terms of a new South Africa, to say what is the syntax, of a South African architectural language, and also what is the language of an African discourse. I believe this is a very important part of my journey, and it continues to be part of my journey. So I began as a student very, very early on to learn from the societies and cultures that have grappled with this complexity. Another interesting culture that will be useful for yourselves to study would be the metabolist movement of the Japanese architects, particularly Akisho Kurokawa. If you track the production of architecture between 1945 up until about 1972, more or less, there's a very interesting journey that they go through, which is very similar in some respects to the South African experience, a place of ancient culture, a place of ancient being, but grappling with this question of what does modernity look like in the context of having a cultural past. So these were my two major, let's call it, informants in terms of how I thought about my architecture. And the logo that you see there is literally the logo that has been on all of my drawings since second year. I used to quarrel with my lecturers that I didn't put my name on my drawings for the reasons that I've just explained to yourself. So there's an underlying philosophy about this question about how do we learn from other societies that have engaged with this question of producing architecture in a new sort of social condition, right? And that social condition puts an imperative on how we read the landscape, how we read the language of architecture, and also how we read where we would like society to be. So it's very much a political act, I would argue. And I do believe that architecture is politics, right? And that where you draw a line or a square or a door or a window is both a functional act as well as a political act that defines human behavior or how humans operate space. So if you take that sort of framing and then you ask, so how is my journey? How did I get the work that I did? What did I do? What was my first project? It's important to remember that these are the things that were informing me. This question of a distaste for obvious ownership or authorship. The second one is the challenge of a discursive architectural practice that is related to time and place. And then I think the third piece is this notion of equity or justice. And it's an ongoing theme in all of my work, because I sincerely believe that every actor, whether you're a lawyer or a scientist or if you think of the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, if you will, it is our role to bring equity back both to the planet and amongst people. So this was how I decided to deploy that attitude to architecture, by being leftist and somewhat radical in terms of how architecture was understood. So my first contiguous building is a police station that I was asked to do in retreat. And part of that journey there it starts to encapsulate some of the points that I mentioned. First of all, there was this crisis that I had to engage with, which was my own relationship to the police, their history, perhaps unfairly so, but their history of violence and of oppressing people. And I was asked to do a police station. And the challenge of that police station in the context of South Africa is also the role of how space is literally policed, right? And if we think of the apartheid city and how movement is structured, and the police were both complicit in these sorts of narratives of displacement and ownership, but now post 1994, the police were meant to serve all people, but they hadn't actually made that full transition, either in terms of the way that they practiced or in terms of the way that the architecture was represented, or even how they saw themselves. And what I decided to do with this particular project, and I'll explain how I got to this brief, was really to start to invert some of the tropes, if you will, around what a police station was. The original brief was very narrow windows that you could shoot out of, which are perfect for resisting riots. There was this idea that you had to have a palisade fence around it to stop people from coming in. There was an idea that the building had to be made of very robust materials that had to, resist weather. So it was a bunker or a fortress mentality. And I think that was very much reflective of the old South Africa. What I did with this particular project is I literally inverted everything on its head. So where there were narrow windows, I decided to make squares. Where they wanted a palisade fence, I removed it. Where they wanted, face brick and other aggressive materials, I decided to give them, just plastered walls. And there were different textures, a combination between slightly sort of rough cast, bagged and painted finish on some elements, and others where it was quite smooth. So it was also a language of, within a limited palette, understanding what could you do with what was available. The plan, oddly enough, picks up on some of these ideas. It's based on a sort of um, cross axis. So the one is a sort of public axis that runs in the short direction, and then in the longer direction is a sort of internal public street, which becomes a place where the police actually retreat from the outside. So it's almost a city at the size of a building, and the little curvilinear space on the corner is a smoker's den, which also acts as the sort of internal public square of the city. Some of you will probably have been exposed to the notion of the agora in Greece, the sort of almost timeless elements that actually configure and define settlement making. I think there was elements of that here. There was even elements of the sort of Roman idea. Originally, when the Roman legionnaires would set up their camp, the grid that they would set up was always on a sort of particular cross axis. I think the term is hexus and decumanus, I forget. So at the same time, I just wanted to mention that in the production of this architecture that was African, that I was searching for the syntax, I didn't abandon the past. So in terms of my journey, I was very conscious about understanding what are the rules and the instruments of architecture as it's traditionally taught, And then how do we subvert those rules and apply them into our own context? So in a way, these are quite conscious acts of decolonization, but I always make the point that you cannot decolonize architecture without understanding the colony. You have to understand Canaan. You have to understand the the language of the discourse of the past in order to insert new language. And you can find similarities to this with hip hop. I also love hip hop, so on. And the way that hip hop takes poetry, or let's call it traditional English, and then subverts it to create a new syntax and a new language, same as it does with music and same as it does with fashion. It's this question about subversion. And subversion is a very big theme in all of my work, but it's not subversion for subversion's sake. It's subversion for strategy's sake. Here you can see the elevation of the building. There's a sort of floating wall at the front section, which becomes a threshold as people penetrate into the interior space. I was quite deliberate that I didn't want it to look like a police station from a distance. I said it could be anything. It could be a flower. It could be an art gallery. It could be a place where the imagination of what the police is becomes something else. And I think that's also an important part of the architectural journey. And the way that I work is to say, when I look at a project, there are preconceived ideas, almost stereotypes, if you will, or categories of what we think a hospital or a clinic or a police station or a stadium should look like. I very much work on the principle of understanding those and then saying, how do we subvert them? So these sort of archetypal architectural typologies are useful at the level of understanding typology, but I do not use typology as the as the direct derivative of what the architecture in the end should look like. So that was also something in the way that I worked and so on. And the building was fairly successful in a number of respects. It had an influence on changing the national policy for the design of police stations. Architects came down and flew to come and see this different building that wasn't designed from a place of fear, but designed from a place of abundance. This notion of this internal street, the use of light, and I think it was very successful in terms of getting that message across. Then the next project I want to show you is a Cape Town train station, and you'll notice that I'm starting deliberately with Retreat because that was my first complete building. But my first work that I did was actually on Cape Town Station, which was an insertion on one of the platforms, Platform 1. And that later evolved into further work where they were encouraged by the work that I did. They said, well, actually, we need 4 more police stations, one in Belleville, one in Retreat, and 2 on Cape Town Station itself. So the other message that I want to give is that, sometimes you start a project without an idea of knowing where it will go. But if you do it well and you have good synergy with your clients, you can find a lot of freedom. I want to credit the police, I think it was Commissioner Krishna, for also supporting me in my journey. It's very important to explain that I think good architecture is alchemy between the design team and the client and a site. And any one of those can fail in terms of the production of good architecture. When I started, I had a lot of resistance from the police, but Commissioner Krishna believed in my vision, and I don't think I would have been able to achieve it without her being part of that dialogue. So I acknowledge her up front. Now, Cape Town Station, interesting building, historical perspective. Obviously, the first railway station in South Africa, if not Southern Africa, intimately tied to this idea of Cape to Cairo. So it has its origins in sort of colonial capture, if you will. It went through different technological lives, from steam to, and then eventually becoming the current manifestation. I think it was late 1960s, I believe, when Vervoet made the statement that this building is a shining example of the apartheid project. So here was a building which is meant to encapsulate this narrative of separation, very different to the ethos of the Retreat project. And the challenge that I had was to say, how do we make this building inclusive? How do we subvert it again? How do I understand its language in a way that becomes constructive? And there was limited resources. So this is something else about my practice, is that there are other architects who practice in a frame where if I want it, it must happen, the client must pay. I'm I come from humble origins in many respects, so I often believe that a lot of the wisdom and the energy is knowing what to fight for to increase the budget if you need be, but in some instances knowing where can you be prudent, where can you be thoughtful, where can you save. And the Cape Town station was a particular example of this. There were many discussions about demolishing the whole building and starting from scratch, given its apartheid history. I thought that was irresponsible. I also, from a conceptual standpoint, if we think of the palimpsest, or if you think about the role of using the past to think about the future, I decided to take that approach. In the forecourt of this building, a place which was previously inaccessible, highly policed, and highly controlled with limited points of access in and out, it became a project of language of openness and continuity. But it also became, for me, part of the urban fabric. It was about connecting it to the castle, to the Grand Parade, the sort of monumental axis, the 1948 developmental axis of the city of Cape Town, and seeing Cape Town Station as partly connecting these different narratives across time, but using public space, most importantly, as opposed to, built form to do it. As I said, it's a site that has a lot of complexity and memories for locals. A lot of, if I can, let me just take a slide back, a lot of banal interfaces. For example, here, you can see two things happening. One is the nonsensical lack of resources. So this desire to have two separate staircases, but there just isn't enough money. So at some point they have to come together again. In many ways, I look at this and it reminds me of our flag in terms of the triangle coming into one, but also the fact that some of these ideas about how we think about space and race and ideology are fundamentally irreconcilable without some degree of convergence. And this was on Cape Town Station. So this is what the space used to look like before. Very difficult to access. You would, probably find yourself on the short end of a stick if you walked across the grass. So it even really wasn't public space. It was like the illusion of public space. And what I suggested was a different platform, a place where we framed that court, abstracted the railway lines to create a sort of almost a mosaic, if you will, of different materials. And then the lights were actually set up to kind of imply a sense of movement and engagement with the city. You can see the effects of what is the so-called value engineering, where some of the softer elements were taken out, which is a pity, including the towers. But what was really fascinating about this space was that on the back of the 2006 World Cup event, which had a fantastic fan mile, we replicated that in Cape Town. So we connected Cape Town Station to the stadium, and it was all about activating the city and creating a new public space. And to this day, it's been successful, not only to help drive, renewed economic growth in the city, but those strategies about shops that open onto the street, coffee shops, and so on. A lot of these ideas were very strange at the time. People thought of businesses as being insular and not engaged with their public context. So this was another layer of my thinking in terms of this project, which was to say, how can architecture create the crucible, if you will, for society to engage? How can urban design create the right sort of conditions where people of different backgrounds, class, color, creed, etc., can find themselves having serendipitous moments of engagement and discovering themselves in different sorts of ways. And this is what the space was like the year after I finished, where it was used to celebrate a New Year's Eve party. And I remember walking there, a space which for until the 1960s, you'd probably be beaten if you walked across the grass, had now become a platform where 30,000 people would celebrate. And for me, this is one of my most proud architectural moments because it shows that you are able to create space and activity without necessarily using form to be in the space, but about how to use form to inform the space, right? So that was a particular joy, and seeing it activated. And these are some of the internal renders that I did at the time. This is what it turned out in the end. And you could see there before the glass was blocked off. You couldn't see outside. It was very dark, very dank. I remember, and you can please excuse me, one of the station managers told me that they used brown and blue tiles because when people vomit, you'll never notice. So that was a good trigger for me to never use brown and blue tiles in Cape Town Station. So again, subverting some of these negative perceptions about how you design for people has always been an important part of my work and part of my engagement. And part of what I also try to get clients to do is that because South Africa is such a wounded place in so many respects, you can see it in the gender violence, you can see it in racial violence, you can even see it in what I've called the passive aggressive political violence, which prevents political parties from working constructively. A large part of the project, I think, for South Africans is to rediscover our humanity. And this happens primarily through the arts. It happens through music, it happens through architecture, it happens through fashion. And I think that there's a profound role to play there where we're almost agent provocateurs in this sort of journey. And here's the space post the render working very much in the way that I imagined it would. This is the Uruguayan team coming for the World Cup. Building on that work, talk in terms of collaboration, how does work proceed? I was then asked to lead a team to say what could the future of Cape Town Station look like if the whole railway lines were sunken underground. How much real estate could we release? And I was excited by this for a couple of reasons. One was that the railway lines take a significant amount of real estate in the city. They actually prevent people from coming to the sea. And we decided to explore how much land could be unlocked and also subvert the apartheid diagram. So in other words, by doing this, could you be able to provide housing on top of the station in a sort of transit-oriented development, housing for those who were the most vulnerable, including government workers, teachers, police persons, nurses, etc. How could you make the wealth, if you will, of the central city accessible to everybody? So this also was an interesting project of subversion, if you will. It was subverting the apartheid urban model. We did copious studies looking at the density of different parts of the neighborhood, the sort of inverse correlation between those who had the most capital lived in relatively low density places, and those who were the poorest had high density. So those who were poor actually needed more resources, which would make sense because of the higher density, but actually they had an inverse relationship. So in Cape Town, it's one of the few cities where those who have the most resources need it the least. And there was a big challenge around this sort of how do we get that message across, and how do we share that understanding. The next diagram that you're seeing here is a model that I created based on some other previous work and so on. It's the notion of how a linear city grows and operates. So again, going back to the retreat project where we have the cross axis, where that sort of red is a sort of public square. You align that cross axis with the beginnings of social infrastructure. And then on top of that, you begin to put in your infill, which would be your second degree or second tier sort of infrastructure. And then you wrap the rest of that with housing. And if you do that along corridors, whether that's a railway corridor or a road or any other sort of mobility system, you have the ability to create linear cities. And why that's important for South Africa is that South Africa's cities were always structured on this question of people dislocated by movement. So the township on the edge with limited ways to come in, people having to commute in and out. Not many people know that in South Africa, we have some of the highest costs per household in terms of transport costs, where in some families, transport can cost you 29 to up to 33% of your monthly income. So we have a very distorted urban form. And that urban form produces inefficient infrastructure, it produces inefficient cities, but it also produces warped social dynamics. So building on that idea, it was like, okay, so if we were to take the railway lines that were coming into Cape Town and we were to see it as part of this sort of linear model, what could it unlock? Some of you may know about District 6, where people were removed over successive generations. And there was an idea about, could this unlock District 6? Could this unlock Culemborg? And it was really fascinating. We demonstrated that although this project would have cost a handsome amount, I won't actually mention the amount of billions it would take to to sink the railway down. We were able to show that it would create up to 90,000, or rather residential opportunities for 90,000 people within the city. And what that would do to transform the nature of the city would be substantial. And just to give you perspective, a study was done at the time that although the broader Cape Town is roughly 3.2 million people, the actual city bowl had only 70,000 people. So here's this strange condition of a city that is highly sprawled, highly distributed, but in the place where there's the greatest opportunity, greatest job creation, you have only 70,000 people, roughly resident, that is. And Cape Town Station was bringing in 270,000 people per day, moving in and out of that. So we have entirely distorted models of mobility, access, and relationships to architecture. And the bigger idea also worked out at a metropolitan scale. We started thinking about what would it mean if we were to think much bigger about unlocking equity from a mobility point of view across the Western Cape. What I did in terms of subversion, this was also quite a fun thing. In creating this new city, all of those green spaces that you see there are actually the reverse of what they used to be. So those are the footprints of forts back when the coastline was closer back. And I was intrigued by taking this sort of military footprint that was currently underground, a solid in a playing field, if you will, and then subverting it by saying, let's take the solid and make it the negative, and then build around it, so that the whole public space system becomes, again, you're moving in these public spaces which are connected to war, connected to genocide, connected to the past. And it also gave a different language. It wasn't just a typical urban grid where you just said, well, this is how the public space system would work. It was informed by culture and memory. So a lot of my work is very much about the conscious act of remembering, but remembering in different sorts of ways. And this was a render we did at the time showing what the Museum of Transport would have looked like. You can see some of the slots that go underground, because that's where the actual train concourse would have been. And yeah, just if I can just take a slide back. This was a view of the buildings that I designed. You know what, I'll give you an interesting point. Today we're seized with the question of climate change, and everybody understands it. We understand the fires around the world. We understand increased temperature rise. Cape Town went through a recent drought. When I did this project, I remember everybody asked me, why aren't the buildings all square? And then I said to them that I'd read a study that showed that due to climate change, there's going to be increased intensity of wind in Cape Town over the next 20 to 30 years. So the way that you counter that is by creating not regular urban forms, which allow the wind to increase speed, but you actually break the form so that the speed gets broken down. And then you also bring the buildings closer together so that at the ground level, you don't have people being blown over by the gust of wind. And I remember at the time, literally my urban design colleagues just laughed at me because they saw the form of the architecture here as upsetting to the notion of the perfect grid. And I was saying that the form is informed by climate, and the form is informed by understanding what's changing. So this was what I call preemptive architecture, whereas they were engaged in, again, an architecture of typology or type, which I think was somewhat sad. But now I think people are thinking in much more creative ways around wind and heat modeling and climate mitigation and climate adaptation, and how architecture can participate in these sorts of narratives consciously, and not just with a blanket 60 by 60 grid with a 5-meter sidewalk and a 13-meter road, and that's how you make cities. That's not how you make cities. Cities respond to climate, topography, wind, and a whole range of other sorts of factors. Pop-ups are interesting here. Now, in terms of the way that I work, and I'm trying to show you a variety of different projects, so we've moved from the small police station. We've touched on this idea of almost reimagining cities. We've touched on how do we think about climate change. I hope you can start to see that with almost every single building, there's an understanding about time, place, and context, but there's also this thing about designing from first principles. My work has some similarities, but in many respects, the projects are wildly different. I'm quite proud of that. I'm very suspicious of style. I'm very suspicious of the playbook the detail that gets repeated 100 times across one's portfolio. I mean, there's room for that. But I've never been that type of an architect. Uh, my lecturer once told me that, with architecture, you have two types of people. You have surfers, right? So these are people who literally skim the surface, but they cover a large, wide territory, but they don't go down. And then you have divers, and that's somebody who goes deep, 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 deep down, but they're not working horizontally. And he said to me that I had the ability to both know when to dive or when to surf. And I think when one thinks about architectural production, I think it's very much about that. Looking at the project and say, is this a deep dive? Do you go down? Or does this project allow you to surf horizontally? And across your career, if you're oscillating between the sort of vertical axis and the horizontal one, it can unlock ways that you think about design strategies and also how you bring people on board with your thinking. So the Sandparks project was an example of me attempting to dive, but actually worked out to be much more horizontal. So Sandparks, South African National Parks, amazing client, asked us to create a sort of headquarters for them, small, modest offices out at the foot of Table Mountain. And some of my earlier thoughts, design-wise, was really about topography. And the idea was how do we have a sort of system of canted surfaces that provide a sort of singular language, not quite Mobius strip a la Ben van Berkel, but something similar, which was to say I didn't want the building to sit on the landscape. I wanted the landscape to become the building. And that was me doing a deep dive in terms of a discourse about connection to landscape and so on. Unfortunately, this didn't work out. And it didn't work out because, the client wasn't ready for that type of radical aesthetic or radical tectonic. I spoke to them about some of the sanatoriums of the early 1920s and some of the work of Mendelssohn and others, where curvilinear forms and institutional architecture could sit side by side. But we ended up in a very different sort of place. And I also wanted to show this sketch because I'm still fairly traditional. Like, I still draw by hand. I do all my drawings by hand. I hand it over to somebody else. I'm highly suspicious of renders that don't have thought behind them, or the perfectly manicured view that's computer generated but doesn't have actual substance. And it's not because I'm conservative and I don't like computers. I love them. But there's something about making sure that there's sufficient thought behind the computer work. And there's a fine line sometimes between that sort of thinking eye-hand relationship versus the click on the mouse relationship in terms of how architecture is produced. Different iterations. This was another version of that concept. I went through, I think, 3 or 4 major design iterations. And the one that I ended up with, I'm just going to quickly go back here, unfortunately isn't a slide, is here, where the building sits in a far much more familiar, typological response of a building that sits on a plinth, some degree of the ramps continuing to play itself through, but much more in the sort of Cape vernacular than what I had actually initially intended. But that triggered another project, which I think is interesting from not quite triggered, but I want to talk about this project because from an architectural production methodology and way of working point of view, this was a fascinating journey for me. I've worked very much. I love museums. My thesis was in museum. I've had the fortune of working and studying them quite closely. I pride myself as it's one of my core areas of expertise. So I proposed a new museum for Cape Town. And what I did with that museum was do a number of things. One was, go out there, use my own practice as a sort of business venture. So I founded an NGO to actually become the vehicle for this. I traveled the world and, formed an alliance of several different museums that said that they would have a relationship from a content perspective. And then even at that point, managed to get an investor who promised to put, 2 billion rand down at the time to invest in the making of this building so long that they could get the bulk. And this was a big part of my evolution because over time I realized that there were lots of constraints in terms of expecting a client to always be able to understand what you want. And I thought that the time had come for architects to reclaim being the client. If you think in some ways of perhaps the relationship that Brunelleschi had when he was working on the dome. I mean, yes, he was working for the church, but in many ways, he was both architect and builder and constructor and involved in the production of what remains today as one of the most amazing pieces of architecture. So I started to be very critical about this idea that that the client is always right, or that architects should always wait for clients. I said that one thing that you need to do is to create the client, to position yourself in the market, to be the client, or to produce work that calls out the right client. If you think of Zaha Hadid, some of her work, it took her years before she got her first client, but it was in the production of that work that eventually the right client came to her. Had she capitulated and just done, golf estates and so on, chances are the clientele that allowed her to do the work of a career probably would not have emerged. So there's also this thing about how do you produce work in order to create the right client, or to find the right type of partners who can work with you on your journey. And this is what artists do all the time, by the way. You see this in art all the time, the relationship between art and patronage. Unfortunately, in architecture, the relationship is architecture and client. And I think we need to reclaim a patronage relationship than over a client relationship. The patron offers you much more agency in terms of expressing ideas. So I decided to be my own patron. Homo situs was an idea partly inspired by a Moroccan philosopher I met in Brazil, who spoke about situated man, Homo situs. And his theory was that humanity is all about place. And even though he was a philosopher and a writer and not an architect, everything for him was about understanding location, 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 location. And that the global makes no sense unless it becomes locally specific. So this question of Homo situs came to mind. I looked at the fractal structures of Table Mountain. I looked at pressure points in the human body, hair patterns, and so on. Started to sketch out what this building would look like, and eventually created a sort of urban precinct. And I did all the calculations that showed that by unlocking bulk adjacent to the actual museum, two things happened. One is that real estate became an opportunity for future development, but it also meant that there was a cross subsidization. So the cost of the museum actually amortized by the bulk that was leased nearby. And this is very similar to how MoMA works in New York. So if you check the plans in MoMA, there's the actual museum, and then there's actually the MoMA Tower, and there's an intimate financial relationship between what the residential tower does to make sure that at least in the beginning, that the finances for the museum could actually operate. So this is something else I also wanted to share with the students, is that when I started my career, I was agnostic of capital. I was agnostic of how, capital flowed. I was, obsessed with, building materials, nuts and bolts, and so on. And it was only when I started to realize that as much as I see a bolt or a nut or a brick, somebody else sees it as a rand or a pound or a dollar or a yen. And unless you're able to articulate what you're doing in their language, it's very difficult for you to achieve what you want in your own language. So this doesn't mean that architects have to sell out and just become business people, but it is about understanding constraints. It is about understanding the limits, and it is about understanding what can you unlock when you're able to shift your language, going back to the hip hop metaphor, and knowing that you're in a different room, in a different space, and how can you talk about buildings in a different way and still achieve your aesthetic and architectural objectives. And that's a night shot, and that's the shot of it. Yeah, this project, again, I mean, for me, it's super fascinating because obviously it was never built, but those of you who would know Cape Town will be familiar with this site, Moka. This allowed me to trigger a conversation about the importance of investing in contemporary and modern art. People didn't believe it was possible at the time. They said, we have the National Gallery. Why should we have another art museum? Art museums are wasteful. They're not priorities. We should be doing housing. A lot of very narrow-minded perceptions about the role of arts and creativity. So fast forward a couple of years later, and okay, my mouse is not moving. Let me just do this. Sorry, did I lose you, colleagues?
No, we're still here. Almost close to 45 minutes over.
Sorry. Okay, I'm close to 45 minutes. I'm not sure what's happening with my connection. The slide isn't working. Do you now see Silo 3 and 4 district, the image with
I do see that, yes.
Okay, great. So I'll just take the next 10 minutes and just quickly give a sense of how those earlier ideas translated into this project, because I imagine some of the questions again, how do you get work and so on. So although that previous museum was never built, I was then contacted by the Veni Waterfront. They said, would you like to be the urban designer for this sort of precinct? We'd like for you to work with VDMMA and a couple of other actors. Thomas Heatherwick is going to be doing the tower, but we need to look at the overall environment because they understood what I was able to demonstrate through my work previously. And we had a look at the site. The silo is a fascinating building. Do have a look at it, those of you who have the chance to come to Cape Town. Otherwise, just check on the internet. Thomas Heatherwick is a world famous architect, Heatherwick Studios. Did some studies looking at the sort of architectural fabric. A Nolly plan looking at what would happen if you start to carve away the base of the actual silo tower and seeing what the public realm would produce. And essentially, let me, if I could just take one slide back. I started to imagine, again, from a sort of urban scale, the different sort of architectural pieces and how they would fit in. And that was the piece of building that I particularly worked on, which was Silo 3 and 4, 72 apartments. And it was also very much about the working aesthetic of the harbor and trying to make it part of its place, but at the same time, speaking to a very, very aspirational, market segment. And I suppose what I was trying to demonstrate here, I mean, if you think of the police station, if you think of the Cape Town station work, etc., my point before about not having a typological frame is that I think every building deserves to be its own child or manifestation in its own right. So as much as I carry with me the trace of me in all of these projects, and I carry my attitude and all of the thoughts that I mentioned up front, for me, it's very much about understanding that each building can be a project in its own right. I'm tempted to stop here at this point. And in some respects, I might not have covered all the aspects of my architectural journey and how I work and how I think. Many of these projects are collaborative also, if I may also mention that. And those collaborations, I'll be dishonest if I said they were perfect. They're often messy. There's lots of disjunction sometimes when people wonder who is the lead architect and who is the lead designer, and whose idea has what sway, etc. I've been fortunate that on almost all of my projects, I have been the lead designer, even if my firm has been, younger and in many instances with less pedigree than some of my compatriots. But my working method is that to be rigorous and thoughtful about what the architecture is attempting to produce, to be thoughtful about time and place, to be competent in terms of execution. I used to tell my staff that everything was concept, content, craft, and we would always start the project and we'd say, but what is the concept? And to me, a drawing of a building is not a concept. Let me be clear. Whenever I say, ask a student what's a concept and they show me a plan, I say that's not a concept. Now you're showing me content. Content is the articulation of a concept. Concept is a free and abstract idea that is divorced of form but informs form. And then craft is then how you put it together. So craft is, okay, so is it steel? Is it wood? Many students and many teachers, frankly, make the mistake of equating architecture to craft or equating architecture to content alone. This is how it works. Here's the spreadsheet. It's functional. But I would often made the argument, and I still do to this day, that architecture without concept becomes building. And there are many buildings around, and there's not enough architecture around. And our role is to create architecture because there will always be builders making buildings and making thoughtless structures. Our role is to accept that is normative, but we study for 6 years plus not to do that, but to create architecture. And I think that has been the thrust of my work and my intention, even if the visual language changes over time. That for me, it's really about understanding concept, content, craft, time, place, and society. Thank you. Can I stop sharing?
Yes, I think you can stop sharing. Thanks, Mokena.
I have 60 other slides, but I don't think I have enough time.
Okay, can you try to stop sharing?
Yeah, I've tried to click it several times, but there it is.
Okay. Yes, I think I must thank you. It was a really nice, wide-ranging presentation. It covered a lot of aspects, and it sort of enlightened, I think, many aspects that people tend to disregard very often in their normal goings on from day to day. So thank you for that. I know that you've got much more that you can actually share with students, because I know that you also provide strategic insight for businesses, etc., which I think is something I know of other architectural firms who does the same, for instance, Firestone Partners, and so on. And I think I always try and encourage students to think, where outside the normal sphere of architecture, where can we use our talents for the benefit of society? And so, even though you didn't get to that, I do thought I'd just mention that for the sake of the students. And I would now hand over to the students for questions, any questions that there might be.
If I may, Christo,
Yes.
if you don't, I'm very happy to give a sort of 90-second explanation of what I do now in terms of strategy and architecture and design, if that'll be helpful. Otherwise, I mean, it's your call, because you're right. I didn't cover it in the slides. Yeah.
Please
do. So there were two things, that happened to me. One was, I love architecture and I'll always be an architect, but what does impact look like? You will notice it in some of my work. It's at an urban scale. I do a lot of work on policy writing. I helped bring World Design Capital to Cape Town. I've been an advisor to the Minister of Human Settlements for Housing for 3 years. And in the last 2 years, I actually play a role as a strategic consultant, a strategy consultant, working at the global scale. So I'm one of a number of leaders, quite frankly, in terms of looking at the forest economy, which might seem like a bit of a stretch, but the forest economy ultimately takes us to wood and wooden construction and low carbon construction. I also sit on the board of the Green Building Council. I advise the World Building Council also. Spoken at COP27 about climate change. And a lot of people say, but what are you doing in that space? But you're an architect. The training that you receive through this 6 years is probably, if you pay attention, because it's also distracting, 6 years can be long. But if you do pay attention, it's it's one of the most enlightening ways of thinking and tackling problems. The way in which we assemble a building, from foundation to door sill, to waterproofing, to window, to ceiling, to roof, is very similar to how you can think about an economic strategy for a country. It's very similar to how you can look at systems. I often tell people that the architect is always confronted by complexity. A bad bricklayer, a good carpenter, a strange, unreliable client, a difficult site, and yet we are always able to produce architecture. And I think a lot of the problems of the world right now require people who have the ability to think in complex frames and synthesize and make solutions. So the work that I'm doing right now is very much in that vein. I am designing the tallest timber structure in Africa, in Gabon. I should have shared that with you. I'll send it to you, Prof. But I'm delighted about being the only architect in the room that's able to change the conversation, to make people be aware of the power of architecture. And all too often, architects are in the wrong rooms. We're not in the rooms where the decisions are being made. We get very frustrated with the city. We get very frustrated with how budget speeches are structured. But it's because we sometimes exclude ourselves from being in those rooms and we want to talk to ourselves. So I'm on a journey at the moment. I'll see where it goes. I'm in a journey about saying architects should be in the rooms where decisions are being made about the built environment. We should not be waiting for the tender, waiting for the last dregs of an idea as it gets watered down between 5 or 10 different actors. We should be formulating ideas about how cities should work. So that's also been my journey, is that in a way I'm now designing strategies. And I promise I'll only design one building a year for the next 10 years. Over.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So I think that's is invaluable in terms of students thinking about their careers and their futures and so on. Thank you. We've got 2 questions so far. I also want to encourage people with questions to put them in the chat box, and then we can read them out on your behalf. So the first question is from Simpiwe. Simpiwe, would you like to frame your question?
Firstly, thank you for your presentation. I found it really insightful, really interesting projects. So I actually have quite a number of questions, but I'll try to stick to 3. Firstly, you mentioned how architects and kind of business people see different components as different things, such as how an architect might see a bolt as a component to fix 2 components together, whereas a businessman sees a bolt as a rand or a dollar or a yen. How does, say, someone who wants to go into architecture, an architect, how does one sort of come to start conscientizing him or herself, so to say, in understanding these things as economic stock? And that leads to my second question, which is the business side of working. What were the biggest challenges that you faced starting your company, and what do you think are the biggest challenges that, say, someone like myself who wants to go into practice and ultimately start my own firm would encounter? Yeah.
So great questions, and thank you so much for the comment. I think the first one is humility. It's such an important thing to have. Humility is recognizing that you and we can talk about Heidegger, we can talk about Foucault, but other people just don't have access to that sort of approach, philosophy, and so on. So you have to be humble about understanding that what you're doing is a bit like a diamond. It shines depending on where you're looking at it, but it's very difficult for people to have the same point of view. Even within the same architectural firm, you might differ on what the building needs to be. So if you're humble, you're able to recognize that other people have the architecture, and you have to find some sort of language which allows you to bridge that divide. But also, importantly, you must not bend over backwards to the point at which your art is being compromised. Now, what I haven't told you is that I've had projects where I felt that even if I was trying to meet this person halfway, I would be unable to do justice and to do what I would call architecture. And those are probably the hardest jobs, because your ego wants you to make it work, and your ego is like, yeah, we can make a plan, and we teach the students, yeah, you can fix it, you can make it right, but sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can't, and I think there's something about being humble about to go into architecture. 3 things. 1, do competitions as much as you can, particularly anonymous ones. My architectural career picked up when I was shortlisted for an international competition, and it was only because it was anonymous. I don't think I would have gotten through. Otherwise, I was competing against many other architects. I came fourth in the shortlisting, and then eventually I became second. I lost to Mashabani and Rose, an amazing firm. So go for competitions, go for spaces where you can show your work, and it's not about the name or your ethnicity or your age. It's just, this is the architecture. So the work speaks for itself. The second thing I would say is, don't wait. I made so many mistakes early on in my career, from not even knowing what an invoice was, from labor challenges, and if I think about starting a practice late in my career when I thought I knew everything, I probably would have been afraid to start my practice. So I think go for it. I mean, I'm
Okay, I think I'm not sure, Boitumelo, have we lost Mokena?
Yes, I'm just contacting him now.
Okay.
sorry. Sorry, can you hear me? I know I have poor network quality. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now again, yes.
I'm gonna switch off my camera just to help with the quality. Can you hear me, colleagues? I just need a voice, then I can finish my point.
Yes, we can hear you. Thanks.
Wow. Okay. No, I'm almost done, but hey.
We can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, great. So you
Yes,
can hear me.
Yes,
So
we can hear
what
you.
I was going to say was, first of all, you're going to make mistakes. Okay. So learn by making your own mistakes. Go out there, build design. The building I showed you in retreat, which I for
Hi, Professor. So I have let him know that we've lost him again.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm back here. I'm not sure what's happening with my technology. I'm just going to quickly say, do go for it. Don't wait until you feel. I mean, for me, when I was studying, I was so happy to just graduate. Of course, I felt like a fraud because I started my company whilst I was still an architectural candidate. I couldn't legally call myself an architect and so on. It's one of the reasons why I called my company a design lab upfront, because I felt guilty about calling myself an architect. But I put myself out there. I marketed myself. I knew I was going to make mistakes, but I just loved architecture, and I loved learning, and I loved being on site, and I loved drawing. So my message to you guys is don't be afraid. Go out there. You will make a building that you one day won't like, and you're going to make lots of mistakes, but the sooner you start, the better. And I look back over my portfolio, the work that I had done by the time I was 35, if I compare it to some of my other colleagues, I feel very blessed. The retreat building that I showed you, I finished the design when I was 28. And then it took me a while to build it. I built it by the time I was 28, yeah, 29. 29 was when I built it, So you don't have to wait until you're 55 or 60 to make an award-winning building. You just have to jump in and do your best and listen to your lecturers and get lots of advice. But you can do it. Over.
Okay. Okay, thank you. The next question we have is from Olive. Olive, go ahead and put your question.
Hi, thank you so much for your work. It's really incredible. I appreciate the mindset with which you approach it. And my question really just has to do with how you started, which is your two fundamental approaches to architecture. But in order for me to ask my question, I just need to give like some context. So I just hope that you can bear with me. So it has to do with African syntax in relation to ornamentation. So my opinion is that modernism teaches that ornamentation is superfluous and truth to material best manifests in a kind of minimalistic, muted sleekness, and a universal design that's divested from culture. And that's kind of what I see both in commercial buildings, but also, even community buildings for architecture. But I really think that people really care about buildings in terms of decoration and ornamentation. And if you think about buildings that internationally people really think are aspirational, like cathedrals and basilicas, those have ornamentation that people really appreciate. So that's my first point. And my second point is that I see a lot, the places that I see ornamentation expressly in South Africa, and like my personal experience, is the gates of people in townships. I've seen like lion heads and mast heads and woven metalwork and, incredible things. And when I see it, I don't think it's a superficial thing. I think it has more to do with a sense of pride and ownership, especially when people have been given, housing that didn't give a sense of pride, but they used ornamentation as a way to create that. So the third point and the last point is that another thing that I do see as well in township architecture, residential specifically, is that I see Ionic and Corinthian columns. And what this tells me is that both the people making these and the people buying them have a kind of desire for referential kind of ornamentation. So not like this universal modern detailing that has no reference, but unfortunately the dominating reference that's considered aspirational is, Greek and Roman architectural components. So my question with that said is, what do you think? Do you think that it's relevant for us to pursue an Afrocentric, culturally specific ornamentation and decoration for architecture in South Africa, not as a superficial thing, but I link this back to the ideas that you expressed in the police station, which for me was so critical because I saw the presentation for it at the Design Indaba, and that was really exceptional for me. So, do you think ornamentation could also be used as a component of making people who were previously dehumanized feel a sense of pride and dignity and importance, but in a culturally specific aesthetic? Or is, Afrocentric ornamentation too low on the hierarchy, and we need to continue spending the majority of our energy more exclusively on objectively more important aspects like climate change and, rectifying apartheid planning, which is incredibly important, but, continuing to do that in kind of the modern style that's been passed down to us. So yeah, that's my question. I hope it makes sense. But it's an important question for me. That's why I ask it.
So for me, I've grappled with this question because on the one hand, I think it's a very personal choice, right? So if you ask me about my attitude to ornamentation, my attitude is no, but that is my attitude, and I don't think that is a universal truth. On the contrary, if we look at the postmodern movement, right, the work of Michael Graves and others, Eisenman's transition, etc., we study architecture and we recognize that in the West that they have gone, even from the arts and culture movement or even the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, that they've gone through both ornamentation, even the Art Deco period, the Chrysler Tower and so on. So my thing is that I think as Africans, we shouldn't be saying either or. I think it's both and. We need to start owning the full spectrum of what architecture looks like. If it means that there will be a moment of a sort of Afro postmodern pastiche, then let it be. If it means that there shall be a moment of Afro modernity or Afro chic, then let it be. If it means that there will be a period of Afro futurism, let it be. And I say this because there's always this burden, I think, and a sort of expected burden on us to produce the perfect response for its time and so on. And yet we can look at all of the mistakes of Western architecture. We can look at what's happening in Japan and how they fuse their culture into their architecture, whether it's through manga or comic books or other sorts of things. And I think that it's not either or. I think it's a very personal decision about how you want to ornament your buildings or articulate it. But I think there's beauty in the ornamentation of the Chrysler Tower. or even the Empire State Building. I think that, you know, Venturi's, you know, essay about a duck and a shed, there's beauty in that, or the house that he made, you know, for his family, or even some of Frank Gehry's work. So for me, I would say that the question is more, what is your attitude to these sorts of things, but to accept and actually embrace that in order for African architecture to flourish in terms of that syntax, we need a very, very wide vocabulary of expression. Now, there are things which can be problematic, which I don't particularly like. So I don't like false Cape Dutch. I don't like Tuscan. I mean, there are many places where I think it's a complete collapse of taste and ethics and thinking. But if I look at it from a systemic point of view, it's important that we don't trap ourselves in a very, very narrow set of definitions of what architectural production is. We might go through our own Bauhaus period, right? We might not. We, you know, so I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. What I'm trying to say is that I think it's actually a very personal decision. I don't think it is a systemic decision. Systemically, I think we just need to be conscious of what we're doing. So as much as people didn't like Michael Graves, he was very conscious about what he was doing at that particular time. And if you look at his work now versus what he was doing in the early 80s, he's also evolved.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate your answer.
Okay. Mokena, are you still with us?
My good friend architects, that's all they'll do. They'll throw plaster everywhere. Yes, I'm here. I'll pause. Sorry. But I hope I made my point, right? It's both and it's personal. It's more about what is your architectural expression. But I think in terms of the broader pantheon of architecture, we need to be thoughtful about ornamentation and allow architects to be rigorous in ornamentation and allow other architects to be rigorous without ornamentation.
Okay. Mokena, you're breaking up. So is that the end to your answer? We've got one more question to get to. Okay.
It is. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay. The last question we have is in the chat box from Tumi. I'll read it out. What's your take on the growing trend of privatizing public spaces, especially in urban cities such as Pretoria?
Terrible, terrible, terrible. That's all. I mean, I think it's also not just in Pretoria. I'm seeing it in Cape Town. And let me explain what I mean by the privatization of public space, because I think there's a difference between privatization and commercialization. I have no problem being in a public square and people are selling ice cream or there's markets and so on. For me, the privatization of public space is when that space gets reduced, it's made smaller, there's limited access in terms of hours, and so on. And I think if anything, it shows two things. One is that it's a society that's not investing in future generations, because the public realm actually is the heartbeat of a city's identity. So it feels like vandalism in many ways. And also it shows, I think, a lack of imagination around how to use public space. And I think because of South Africa's particular history where public space was visual and not truly public, we have a very diminished relationship to it. Which makes it vulnerable to speculation. In other cities, you would never think of doing to public spaces what we do. So we have to create the culture around public space, and that's also, I think, our cities are fundamentally unsafe because we have a strong suburban ghetto mentality that makes public space almost as outside or a place of danger as opposed to a place of gathering and commonality. So it's absolutely terrible. And if there's one thing I'd like you students to do, I mean, you can even make terrible buildings or ugly buildings, just please protect the public space. Because you can always change the buildings, but if you take away public space, it's very difficult to bring back.
There was a question from Simpiwe, but it sort of seems to be disappearing off my screen and then it's back. So I'm not sure, but Simpiwe, will you please ask your question?
Hi everyone. I'm not sure if everyone can hear me. Oh, Makeka.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm Simpiwe. I was actually, just to start, I was really inspired to study architecture because of you. My mom was the
Oh,
station
wow.
commander. My mom was the station commander of the police retreat station. After I recently saw the top billing clip, I was like, Mom, I want to study architecture because of this guy. Fast forward a few years later, boom, done my degree, and currently now I'm working for Ripple Fox and Partners. So my question, particularly, especially with the project that you have done in the township, in reference to the book on township economy that's written by one of the Tarish Govender, which is also an architect. It's just an interesting topic that I sort of wanted to ask you, that I think I might sort of want to delve into in terms of the township economy, with the project that you also have done, which is Tusong. What are the sort of what are the ways that one could sort of tap into the sort of the township economy, and what role does architecture have in terms of racial sort of
Well, I
racial
mean, first, let me,
social inequality?
Go ahead.
No. I mean, what can architecture do for a lot of aspects, especially pertaining to social economic inequalities, particularly in South Africa, particularly in Cape Town? And what was my other question? And how does one mitigate risk, or how do you overcome that? Taking into account that there are other issues that might come in play, like policy related issues, and so forth and so forth. Yeah, maybe I'm a bit vague about the question, but yeah, something along those lines.
So I first of all, I'm so privileged and grateful and frankly overwhelmed that you were inspired to do architecture. And I'm really excited to hear that your mother was a station commander. Right? That's probably the most touching thing I've actually heard in my architectural career. So you made my day in my career. So thank you for that. And I'm not joking. I kind of heard a little bit. You broke off of that. Were you asking me about? I mean, just quickly in one sentence, what were you asking about township architecture? Yes, I've worked in the townships quite a bit actually, but what was your question? Because you broke off.
Oh, sorry. I think it's the network that I have. So I'm from Ikailija, so I'm quite aware of the building that you have done, which is the Toswang.
Yeah.
So I've been checking out this other book called Township Economy. It's just an interesting sort of topic or issue that I'm sort of interested in, and in how does one sort of find ways of developing the township into becoming sort of a lot at a sort of at the standard of sort of your CBD per se, or how does one think about ways of. And I mean,
Okay.
I understand, particularly, not to make my question long, I know the time. I know particularly with you had to sort of initiate the budget of that project to actually be more than its current than its initial budget. So I mean, my question is a bit broad, but how does one tap into those spaces?
I think I've got it.
Yeah.
This actually is like almost the exact opposite of the previous question about public spaces in Pretoria. The only way that you can make townships to work, and I believe this thoroughly, is by investing in the public realm. The mistake of Kailicha was the assumption that if you put a shopping mall, that everything would then work. And so, for example, the Tusong Service Center, which I think was the right type of gesture, right? So public realm includes public buildings, hospitals, clinics, law courts, schools, etc. But I think they made the mistake of assuming that a shopping mall is the equivalent of public space making. And that's not the case. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Khayelitsha CBD doesn't work as well. All of the great cities, going back to the Agora that I mentioned, etc., have made a concerted effort in public infrastructure, roads, safe play spaces, etc. And then on top of that, going back to that linear diagram that I showed you, once you create the public square, once you create it on a movement system, then your next infill are your social infrastructure, and then the next infill becomes your housing and other sorts of components. Because I actually think in our country we got it wrong, because we spent a lot of money thinking that what we should do is provide housing, whereas in fact what we should be doing is providing public space in the right places so that people can allow for housing markets to evolve naturally. Now that's a radical proposition for our politics in our country, but honestly, it's the best way to make sure that a township becomes a town in the shortest time possible. And unfortunately, we haven't got that equation right. We're spending the money on the sort of wrong things and the wrong emphasis. Because if you actually hyper invest in the public realm of Khayelitsha, whether it's through adding trees, statues, public squares, etc., and you make it attractive, that's how you create value, because that investment translates into attraction. People then decide they want to live nearby. And then if you make good schools, people say I need to live next to the school. And that's how cities grow. You create the public realm first and everything else follows. And that's why destroying the public realm is one of the worst things you can do to a city, because it actually kills the very thing that makes cities tick. And that's the end of my response. I hope that's helpful.
No, thank you so much, man. I really appreciate it.
So thanks for that, and I can only applaud that and say I fully agree with that. We've got one last question that we can fit in from Lerato. Lerato, if you can go ahead and put your question to Mokena, please.
Hi, Mokena. First of all, thank you so much for your insightful presentation. My question is more of a technical way of working. In architecture schools, they always advocate for teamwork, and you've mentioned collaboration and leadership in the design phase, but we know that it sort of goes beyond that. And just to reference your Cape Town courtyard where the soft materials were replaced, and I'm guessing that would have been a quantity surveying or engineering question. In a world where in a built environment where you're moving towards the building information modeling, what is your take on the BIM process? And if you've used it in one of your buildings, what was the impact of it?
To be honest with you, and it's not popular, I think it's let's talk about speed. Okay, what I mean by speed, there's a certain slowness that happens when you draw that allows your subconscious mind to understand what it's drawing, right? So whether it's a piece of bump or a piece of pencil, or you're doing a section, and that slowness is actually where because our brains are so complex, they're able to compute multiple degrees of information at the same time. So you could be thinking of a poem and thinking of light, the thickness of the glass, the color, the sound that a wooden floor makes on the back section of a brick wall versus, and all of that happens as you're drawing. Now, the difficulty, I think, is that when we have BIM, the speed there means that it's actually too fast for thought. So it pops up instantly. And it gives us the illusion that it is thoughtful. So what happens is that and there's many buildings around Cape Town and elsewhere where you can tell it's the BIM model that was quickly banged out, or it was like a SketchUp model that was done to stage 2, and then somebody said detail it. And it totally missed stage 3, stage 4, or even multiple iterations of the concept itself. So, it's not popular because I think we have to use BIM. It's inescapable. Clients want it because it gives them the illusion of speed and certainty, and we need to master it as we need to master any other material. But I'm going to leave you with a thought, which is one of my lecturers told me, he said architecture is a slow topography. And so what he says, the job of the architect, funny enough, and it's not popular, is to slow things down. So when you go to a site, what does it smell like? What do you see? Slow things down to make sure that you have enough time to think about what does the building need to be. And the struggle of architecture is kind of, you know,
Mokena, are you still there? I think we've lost Mokena. Okay.
Yeah, I think we can wrap it
Yes.
up.
Okay. Unfortunately, that's as much as we can fit in. And unfortunately, I have to thank Mokena in his absence. But I think it's been very interesting. And
I'm here. I can hear you. Sorry, I just came back. So.
Okay.
You know, I just want to say slowness is important. Slowness is a we see it as a problem. It's actually an asset. Great architecture happens by knowing how to slow things down and when to speed things up. And if you can get that right, you'll be fantastic. But sometimes you need to know when you're being rushed and you need to hit the brakes. Otherwise, you will make mistakes. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing your wisdom and your experience in many different types of buildings and different environments with us. Thanks. I know you're quite busy, and it's been a privilege for us to host you and to share your insights with our students. Thank you very much. Thank you also to everyone who attended, all the students and other guests from across South Africa. I was glad to hear that there was some Piwe from Khayelitsha also talking to Mokena, also in Cape Town via Johannesburg. So it's always, you know, how technology makes the world smaller. That was great. Thank you very much to the GSA ops team for putting the whole show together and for getting everything organized so smoothly. And a nice evening to everybody else. Thank you very much. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, Mokena.
Thank you. Bye.
Cloudless skies, fireplace beneath the stars. Stories that they told us, stories that they told us we believed, and there we fell in love. From there we fell in love. When we were young, when we were young.